Okay, anytime.
Welcome, everybody. It's a delight to be here and to welcome our speaker, Shoshana Fershtman, who is both an attorney and a doctor, is a Jungian analyst and psychologist in Sonoma County. She is a member analyst and teaches at the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco. She has served as core faculty at the Sonoma State University and Meridian University Graduate Psychology Program, offered workshops on Jewish mysticism, transgenerational trauma, the divine feminine. She studied Jewish mysticism for several decades with teachers from Jewish Renewal and Reconstructing Judaism, and serves on the spiritual leadership team at Congregation Ner Shalom in Katati. She spent decades as an attorney advocate for environmental, social justice, and indigenous rights. What a wonderful opportunity for us to speak with Dr. Fershtman, and I've loved the book so far. So welcome, everybody. I think it'll be a very wonderful evening. Welcome, Dr. Shoshana.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's really good to be here with everyone. There's it's some people I know from my beginnings of engaging with Jewish Renewal in the Bay Area in the late 90s and early 2000s. And then we were blessed enough to start to have our own renewal congregation up in the North Bay. And so some of our members from there and some friends from school and training. So it's I'm just going to pull up my notes here, and I have a short PowerPoint that I would like to share. So let me just get situated here for a moment. I just want to say first off, this is such an honor for me to be here with the Minyan, because the book is about the gift that Jewish Renewal and Jewish Renewal congregations provide to people psychologically, and the healing that happens for people who engage deeply with Jewish Renewal. And so I feel like this is an offering to the Minyan and to many congregations across the country and across the world that have done this work and are bringing really the connection to our collective memory of Judaism that has been really lost for many of us who, even if we grew up Jewish, either grew up secular or grew up without knowing the depths of the tradition. And my own experience with Jewish Renewal was so powerful psychologically and so healing. And I was in graduate school in psychology at the time, and I felt like I really wanted to understand how this was moving in other people, what was going on inside of them as they connected more deeply with Judaism and especially with Jewish mysticism. And so I conducted a study, a 2-day study with 10 people from Bay Area Jewish Renewal and Reconstructing Judaism congregations, and 2 people it's everybody's a pseudonym in the book, but since Abigail and Shoshana have already stated here publicly that they were in the study, I'm really so delighted to say that they were part of the study, and I think really important part of creating the container that allowed people to share so deeply about their connection to Judaism, but also one of the, I think, most potent things that we explored together was how our relationship to our ancestors, both personal and in the larger sense of Jewish ancestral memory, was kind of cut off or really occluded, and what happens when we open back up to that transmission. So and I'm going to pull up I'm going to share my PowerPoint here. So I'm going to do a little bit of lecture and PowerPoint, and I really hope we have a lot of time for discussion. As I'm going to focus tonight on just two themes, but let me just start the PowerPoint, and then this will all. Okay. Okay, now hang on, just need to. Oh, I know what I need to do. I'm sorry. I just need to.
You can make a.
I think I just need to do it so I can make it not full screen, and I think I just can do that like that. Yes, that way. Now, are you seeing that slide on your screen?
We are.
Okay, great. So as we had the 2-day study, which was very, very rich, and a lot of what was shared, what is in the book. But when I went to make meaning of what had happened in the study, I had an intuitive sense that the experiences of individuals reconnecting with Judaism in the post-Shoah era, the post-Holocaust era, I had a real sense that their journeys and my own journey could be seen through the lens of the Exodus story. What was really so moving to me was I spent many years after the study, after I completed my doctorate, turning the findings into a book, and I started working with the Exodus story, and each chapter in the book corresponds to an archetype in the Exodus story. What I found so profoundly moving was how deeply psychological the Exodus story is. As I explored the Midrash, I saw how the story had been amplified over the course of millennia with the wisdom of people who were also grappling with the same questions that we face in our time: how to maintain one's spiritual and psychological center and protect the cultural psyche in times of overwhelming collective trauma. This collective wisdom is also strikingly aligned with our own growing psychological understanding of how the psyche heals from trauma, both personal and collective. So the psychological truths contained in rabbinic and Kabbalistic interpretations of the Exodus reveal the way to move out from the narrowing of consciousness engendered by trauma to healing, to reclaiming access to the wisdom of the self, what Jung called the self, or the totality of the psyche. These insights reflect current understanding about how we are affected by and how we heal from trauma. And I think this is really, the essence of the book, in a way, that we have had, unfortunately, many periods of collective upheaval in Jewish history. And in the wake of each of these periods, there has been a welling up of mysticism. And in those mystical teachings is guidance about how to stay connected to Judaism and also to the sacred. So the book and the Exodus story starts with exile. And this is a teaching from Joseph Gigatia, who was a medieval rabbi, mystical rabbi. And he taught that the journey in exile allows us to descend to the place where holy sparks are hidden and need to be redeemed. When these sparks are redeemed, a new consciousness emerges. Gikatia taught that had God not placed the people in exile, they would not have willingly gone into the desert and would not have received the Torah. The suffering of exile opened the people to a new consciousness, able to directly receive the light of God. Gikatia suggests that being open to receiving the wisdom of Torah requires that each individual personally suffer the despair and hopelessness of the exile before finding his or her way to the supernal light. And as a psychologist and an analyst, working with trauma, I just think this is such a beautiful teaching about trauma, that even though it puts us into profound suffering, there are sparks and gifts that we discover that we might not otherwise discover, even though we never would ask for the trauma. There's tremendous learning and things for us to find that maybe open us to the light of the divine in a deeper way. The book also contextualizes Jewish renewal as a resurgence of mysticism in the post-Shoah era. And Gershom Scholem, who is a great scholar of Jewish mysticism, said that in the wake of each of these collective traumas, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the Inquisition and the massacres in the Eastern Europe that gave rise to Hasidism, that each of these periods gave rise to a type of mysticism. And he wondered in our own time whether the tremendous trauma of the Shoah would give rise to a new form of mysticism. And I sense is that that's what Jewish renewal really is. It's Jewish renewal we know is often spoken about as a neo-Hasidism, and the reclamation and restoration of Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism. What I found interesting and very meaningful was that the reclamation of Jewish mysticism really came about by the scholars who were in the midst of Nazism. So Martin Buber and Gershom Scholem, and also a student of Jung's, Erich Neumann, who many people may be familiar with. He wrote The Origins and History of Consciousness and The Great Mother. Martin Buber wrote Tales of Hasidism, and that was very meaningful to many of the people in this study as a way of knowing that there was a Jewish mystical tradition, even when it wasn't transmitted through the family. And he inspired Gershom Scholem and Erich Neumann at the kind of early part of the 20th century in Germany, as Nazism was gaining ground. Gershom Scholem, as many of us know, dedicated his life to discovering the great mystical works of Judaism known as Kabbalah. His work is largely responsible for creating our modern perception of Kabbalah as a discrete realm of Jewish study. And in the time that Scholem and Neumann and Buber were around and really giving Kabbalah its due, it was a time in Central Europe in the early part of the 20th century where the Jewish Academy was really distancing itself from Jewish mysticism and wanting to appear to be very rational and treating Kabbalah as superstitious. So, the distancing from Jewish mysticism really started in the early part of the 20th century, or maybe the late 19th century. But for many Jews growing up in this country, they already stepped into a culture where Jewish mysticism had been very distanced from. And even though many American Jews came to this country and their grandparents or parents were Hasidic or from a Hasidic lineage, when they came to America, they came into a culture that was kind of created by Central European Jews that had really bought into this ethos of being rational and trying not to look too different. So there was a real loss of transmission and a real distancing from the Jewish mystical tradition that most people growing up in the post-Shoah era really didn't have access to Jewish mysticism. And this is a student and associate of Carl Jung's, Rivka Scharf-Kluger. She studied with Jung in Germany and went to live in Israel, and has written several really beautiful books about the psychological meaning of some of the how psyche lives in the stories in scripture. She writes, for Jewish individuals who have either never encountered this essential part of themselves, meaning the Jewish mystical tradition, or have lost their bond with it, the experience of connecting with and living from their roots is essentially a psychological rebirth. Such renewal can only come to the individual searching for the way to his or her own depth, to the inner well of Judah. So one of the major premises of the book is that Jewish collective memory is a layer of the psyche that is very connected to who we are at our depths. And if we don't have a way to connect with that, we often lose access to a large part of our our religious function or our spirituality. And that's one thing, again, that the Minyan, I think, has been so important, and Jewish Renewal is giving people access to this deep layer of the psyche. And that's very psychologically transformative. Here's Reb Zalman. It's a beautiful quote. I believe we have lost our stories, and I believe that unless we redream the myths that keep us alive, we are not going to be able to heal the planet. So the importance of myth and the Jewish myths that have been really almost lost and really needed to be rediscovered and re-inhabited, which I think is a lot of what Jewish Renewal allows, is not only the story of the myth, but a way to access the psychological experience of the myth through practice. And I think many people know that Reb Zalman immigrated from Vienna to the United States when he was still a teen and began outreach to college students in the late 60s as a Chabad rabbi, and then became transformed by the counterculture and his engagement with it, and began to develop a form of Judaism that brought Hasidic mysticism into connection with depth psychology and feminism, and along with many of the rabbis that we're familiar with, Bert Jacobson here in the Bay Area, and Art Green and Arthur Waskow, coalesced into various renewal congregations. And as Abigail taught me, in 1974, the Minyan was formed after a month-long workshop with Reb Zalman on Jewish mysticism. Another important stream, I think, in Jewish Renewal and in many of us being able to reconnect with Judaism is the involvement of women and women as leaders in Jewish renewal and in Jewish mysticism. And I just will say that in the book, I really look at the women's movement and the voices of Jewish women and the women's spirituality movement, and how the divine feminine, which has always been in the text as the Shekhinah, but only in our time. I think it's a remarkable time we live in, because women are interpreting and giving expression to ways of understanding the Shekhinah and the deep feminine, and also how to embody practices that are very much in the feminine experiential realm. I will say that many of the chapters in the book are really explore the feminine archetypes in the Exodus story, many of which are, in the Midrash, not maybe as well known, but I thought very, very important and key to understanding how we heal from trauma is through our connection to the feminine and to relatedness and compassion and empathy, and that we really cannot heal trauma without engaging the feminine at a very deep level. So I thought I'd just visit shortly two of the archetypes in the story. One is Moses, what we're all familiar with. And this is, I'll just read a little bit from the chapter on Moses. When we experience the divine presence in our lives, it may herald the beginning of an individuation process in which the psychic center shifts from the conscious personality, or what Jung called the ego, to a relationship to the divine or the self. So instead of thinking that this is all of who I am, I realize I'm in a relationship to something much larger. Jungian analyst Edward Edinger saw Moses as the way shower who brings our conscious mind into relationship with the self, the totality of who we are becoming. And this is one of the teachings I love about Moses. This is from a fresco in Dura Europos in Syria in the 3rd century. And it's a beautiful teaching that Moses really arose from the holding and support of the sacred feminine. So they say that 7 women made the Exodus possible, and explore that in the book. But here they are holding and supporting the emergence of this sacred masculine that's going to guide the people out of Egypt. Rabbi Arthur Green observes that the name that God speaks to Moses, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, is sometimes translated as I shall be. I was, I am, and I shall be. This means nothing less than the truth that God is being itself. There's not a place, not a moment, not a thing, certainly not a person that is not filled to overflowing with the divine presence. And I think for many of us, encountering Jewish mysticism and really transforming the God image from this, figure up there or out there, to the infusion, some energy that's infused and underlies all of creation, opened a way for us to relate, and also to become open to spiritual unfolding. Moses represents what Jung called the transcendent function, leading us out of the narrow place of consciousness centered only in the ego to the expansive promised land of connection with the self. The continuing process of bridging these two aspects of consciousness is what Jung referred to as individuation, becoming one's true self. A spiritual awakening may happen in a powerful moment, often a synchronistic one, in which our everyday consciousness tears open to reveal the archetypal pattern guiding our lives. We awaken to what Jung called the self, that aspect of us that carries the spark of the God image, the spiritual dimension of existence. For Jews who grew up in secular families that rejected spirituality altogether, or in observant families in which spirituality was not shared in a way that could be meaningfully internalized, the awakening to this archetypal pattern in the context of Judaism can be both powerfully surprising and deeply familiar. When the archetypal pattern of our lives opens to us in uninvited and uncanny ways, we may experience this breakthrough as synchronicity. The world is speaking to us and showing us that we need to pay attention, for we are in the presence of the great mystery. The fire that Moses encounters in the burning bush is a manifestation of God's presence in the earthly realm, a meeting of spirit and matter, a unification of the transcendent and immanent realms that prefigures the great meeting that will follow at Sinai. The fire is a spiritual flame that guides our engagement with the great mystery of life. As we draw near to it, it illuminates the darkness that once shrouded the unconscious realms and invites us in. And this is a story from one of the men in the study, who I call Daniel. And this is an example of how these stories from the Exodus are lived experience. So Daniel was raised by socialist, secular parents and was taken completely by surprise when, as a completely secular young man, he saw the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the leader of the Hasidic movement, Chabad, lighting a giant Hanukkah menorah with a cherry picker. And many of us have seen that on TV or in person. Daniel was unexpectedly overcome with emotion and burst into tears. He recalled weeping and weeping. It completely broadsided me. I had no idea what was going on. Daniel began exploring Judaism more actively the following year, attending Rosh Hashanah services at a Jewish Renewal congregation in Berkeley. As the service began and people started praying, he was not sure why he had come. Everything felt unfamiliar. Then at some point during the service, he had a sudden awareness. He thought to himself, oh my God, this is why I am who I am. This tradition, these prayers, this everything is how I got to be who I am. And how did I not know that before now? And then that was it. He began what has become a lifelong journey of a deepening reconnection with Judaism. And as I sat with Daniel's story and looked in the Midrash and the teachings, I found this teaching by Reb Nachman of Bratslav. The great Hasidic master Reb Nachman of Bratslav taught that the deeper meaning of Hanukkah is the opportunity to light the inviolate spark of Judaism that lives inside each Jewish person, even one who has forgotten his or her connection. This spark is akin to the single vial of oil that had not been desecrated by outside forces, discovered amid the destruction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and used to light the menorah, symbolizing the temple's rededication to holiness. Daniel experienced the transcendent moment of opening to Judaism when he witnessed the lighting of the menorah. The significance of the transmission through the leader of Chabad Hasidism reflects the healing of a lineage that was broken when Daniel's father turned away from Judaism. What came to be revealed, and I explore this in the course of the book, is that Daniel's paternal lineage, his grandfather, his paternal grandfather, was the only one of, I believe it was 11 brothers who were able to leave Eastern Europe, and the rest, his great-grandparents and all his great-uncles and aunts were killed in the Shoah. So something broke through for him in that moment, very powerfully. The Lubavitcher Rebbe carried the sacred love for Judaism that Daniel saw reflected. He had a relationship with his father's father, who would pray and daven in the hallways in the mornings. And even though his father couldn't explain to him what that meant, it was very moving for Daniel. The rabbi's deep honoring of the tradition conveyed in performing this sacred act of lighting the menorah broke Daniel's heart open to the beauty of Judaism. He experienced a revelatory moment when his innate spirituality found a home in Jewish ritual. William James, the great psychologist from the turn of the century, last century, said, "A man's character is discernible in the mental or moral attitude in which, when it came upon him, he felt himself most deeply and intensively active and alive. At such moments, there is a voice inside which speaks and says, 'This is the real me.'" And I'll just share this last paragraph. Jews raised without a spiritual connection to Judaism may experience a sense of amazement to discover the beloved speaking in the language and rituals of their ancestors. And I want to say that can be a lineage that's a blood lineage, but also for many people who are called to Judaism who weren't born Jewish, the ancestors call in a different way, calling them home in a way that is at once completely foreign and achingly familiar. Writing of the Havurah movement, which invited Jews to create collaborative communities to develop study and ritual, Judy Patonsk notes that the impulse behind the movement was the need to understand this Jewishness stirring inarticulately within us if we were to become whole persons. The Jewish stories were our stories, a lens through which we could understand the world and ourselves. To become more Jewish was to become more ourselves. So I just wanted to offer these questions for us to maybe sit with for a moment about just inviting you to recall if there was a numinous moment for you where you felt that connection to the sacred and where that broke through in a way that you hadn't previously experienced, and what impact that had for you in your life.
I'll go.
Yes.
Hi, Reb Shoshana. Yeah. Hi. Well, we're in the book club, so we're really enjoying your book.
Oh.
And I did have a spiritual breakthrough. I was brought up Reform, but as people know, I had a very unhappy childhood because of trauma. And I went through decades of therapy, and I feel like at some point, and then I also used medicinal, things too, which is prevalent around, the area, just to try to understand and just make sense of what happened. And I was on a hike one day with the Jewish Singles Hiking Club. We looked over the Bay Area, and I had never seen anything so spectacular. And the backstory is I had a picture of the Tree of Life on my refrigerator for years. And it was a 2D picture. I didn't know what it meant. I know the prayer was, "It is a tree of life to those who hold fast to it. Its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace." That's all I knew. I didn't know what it was, but I came back, looked at the picture, and I saw Tiferet. in the middle of the tree. And I said, that's what I felt. That's what it was, an indescribable feeling. And all of a sudden the tree became 3D. And as most people here know, I've been trying to explore the rest of the Sefirot ever since then. And that was like 15 years ago. So that was my connection.
Oh,
thank you for asking.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
I would like to say something, even though you can't see me. I'm Susan Diamond.
Yes.
Mine was,
yes.
I was very young. To be honest, I was 2 years old in a newly formed temple called East End Temple, a Reformed temple in Manhattan. And my parents took me to my first service. I think they said I was like 10 months, whatever. But by the time I was 2, I kept saying to my parents, I want to go to temple. Take me to temple, take me to temple. And I always felt like I would, like in another plane. And then my mother gave me a book called Molly and the Sabbath. And I didn't think of this until you were just talking. I got this book called Molly and the Sabbath. And I would keep saying, read it to me, mommy, read it to me, mommy, you know, over and over again. And then I said to my mother, can we light candles like Molly and her mother? And my mother said yes. And my parents, they were Reformed. And they had both been brought up Orthodox, and they wanted, it's a long story, but anyway, they weren't lighting candles or anything. So my mother said yes. And I lit candles with her, and then I've never stopped. And I've had so many moments, and I was very involved in Reform Judaism and found deeply spiritual moments at the summer camps. I mean, being in the redwoods, being outdoors for services, seeing nature, and just always struck with this awe. And most recently, I was taking a walk yesterday, and I was along a babbling brook in, I guess, the mountains near Half Bay. It doesn't matter. And I just stood there for a while, and I was listening to the birds, and it really felt in the stream, and it felt like a God moment. Mm-hmm. And I saw my dad with fishing, and my dad he didn't really know it, but he had a deep spiritual connection in many ways. And I'm talking about energy and compassion, not the traditional. And so I was really drawn to renewal for sure. But, you know, I just really felt this energy. And when it would leave, if I didn't feel it, I really felt down. It's hard to explain because I've been through moments of deep anxiety, depression. I mean, you know, at different moments in time. And I always ended up turning to God, a mystery. And here Zalman said the Ein Sof was divine mystery. I could go on, but I'm going to stop now.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for bringing the natural world in too, because I think, I know for me, that was the gateway, and feeling the Shekhinah, you know, imminent in all creation, and feeling that as a spiritual experience and a gateway. And I've been very interested of late in, you know, the divine feminine roots and the Asherah and the you know, the sacred tree.
I'd like to share something, please.
Yes, please.
I have come again and again back to Judaism. When I was a young lady, my parents went to a conservative temple. And so my brother was put on a pedestal while I was left to my own devices to be pretty and cute and do ballet. So I studied at Sunday school with everybody else, and I was an advanced student. I was skipped 2 grades, and I read the things. I had asked many questions about it, and I wanted to learn Hebrew. And they said, girls are not allowed to learn Hebrew. I said, but I really, really want to. Mm-hmm. And my mother said, so you can get your ears pierced. Mm-hmm. So they got my ears pierced. Oh. And I became involved later in B'nai B'rith and some other things, but it was very peripheral. When I was in my mid-20s, I was going to school at Humboldt State University, and there was a Hillel group, and it was Reconstructionist, and we had meditation walks along the beach, and we had the wonderful Jewish tradition of Shabbat storytelling, and we had some fabulous stories that we were able to share. And I began to think about it, and there was a temple. And we only had a rabbi come and visit us once every 2 weeks, but then it was lay led. And I was a teacher, and some of my students were in the temple. And I decided I was going to go back to the temple, and I decided I was going to be bat mitzvah. So I was working with a rabbi who only came once every 2 weeks and a cassette tape. I learned my bat mitzvah portion. I had a Pentateuch. I knew my Haftorah, and I was graduating college the same weekend that I was bat mitzvah.
Oh,
it was
how
the only
wonderful.
time in my entire life that my parents came to visit me from New York to California. And I had been spurred on it partly by the group and partly because I found a piece of jewelry and I looked at it, and it was a Hebrew word, and I asked someone, what does it say? It says Shekinah. And so I was able to sing the troph and do my portion and celebrate and graduate. And my mom was with me and my dad was with me, and my mom had held on just that long, and 2 weeks later she passed.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
But she saw me move forward spiritually, academically, and in my career. And I think she was holding on for that. And it was a really meaningful ceremony. And I sang my own songs, and I had people from different denominations attending. And it was a very enlightening period in my life. And it was way up in the redwood trees as well. And I had nature surrounding me constantly. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful story. Thank you. So glad you had that experience and that your parents were with you. So moving. Marty.
My adult conscious reconnection with Judaism was not like a God event, but I had left New York at the age of 25 to go to California to become a hippie. And somehow I wound up teaching speed reading on the road in the deep South for 2 years, which in itself probably opened me up to new things. But it was the first time in my life I was really beyond the influence of Jewish New York and my Jewish parents. And I was still in my post-adolescent rebellion against Judaism. But I started reading because there was no Jewish anything around. It opened up the opportunity for me to start being more interested. And when I started thinking about our three major holidays, Shlosh Regalim, Passover, Shavuos, and Sukkot, I said, gee, we all have these historical stories about that, going out of Egypt, Mount Sinai, in the desert. I say, but they're all based on agricultural festivals. How come we don't emphasize the origin? And it was through that, and I must have touched a collective unconscious moment. This is like 1975 or 6, that Jewish Renewal was, gaining momentum at the time, I suppose, because by the time 2 years later I got to California, and through my own thought processes and feelings and intuition, and when I ran into a Rabbi, Hanan Sills, and the Jewish and the Aquarian Minyan, I said, boom, this is what I'm looking for. But I had already become what I was looking for when I met it, before I met it. It was a fascinating experience.
Oh, it already happened. It's already happening inside of you, and then you met
Right.
with it on the
Then I met the
outside.
manifestation of it.
Oh, thank you.
You know, I would like to share if I could.
Yes, please.
Last summer, I started humming that reggae song by the Waters of Babylon. And I found myself humming it so frequently, morning, late in the afternoon. And I asked, I'm a psychotherapist, I asked a colleague, what is it about that song you think that is coming up? And the song is about exile. The Jews have been captured by the Babylonians. So I started wondering, in what way was I feeling exiled? And next thing you know, your book came out, and it was in the Jung library. And it said, the title immediately grabbed me, about exile. So I'm very interested in coincidences. I got the book, I started reading it, and within the first couple of chapters, it mentioned Rabbi Shefa Gold. So I went on her website, and apparently in a month's time, if I was interested, I could join a retreat in southern Utah with her and other rabbis who have a study group. The whole workshop was a study group around the Song of Songs. And so there was chanting in the morning, celebration. And I came from a conservative, very intellectual background in Philadelphia, and always longed for the music of Shlomo Carlebach. I was very drawn, without realizing it, to the mystical. And in fact, going on this retreat, I introduced your book to the other rabbis, and came back with their recommendation that I join the Minyan, and started the book group. And it's just it touches my soul that it's led by these coincidences to the wisdom that you're sharing. And it just feels very calming and very soothing to have found my way through all these signs and symbols to a renewal internally. So I want to thank you.
Oh, thank you, Judith. That's so moving, and so many synchronicities and connections, and just really moved to hear how moved you are by the book, and where it moved you to connection with others.
I'm in a chanting group every Thursday with online with Shefa Gold and her community, and it's just been wonderful.
Yeah, she has been a real teacher for me, and I know for a lot of people in this study, it was such a gateway back through her chants and her teachings.
Thank you.
Sarah.
Well, Judith was just mentioning Shlomo, so I had to jump in. When I first came to California, I was living in Santa Rosa and going to the JC, and that was 50 years ago. And I felt like I was in a spiritual desert because I couldn't really find any Jewish people or things to do. And then I saw a sign on campus that said that there was a singing rabbi coming to Sonoma State. And I thought, my goodness, what an odd thing, a singing rabbi. And so I said to my friend, that looks interesting. Let's go and see what it is. And she said, well, I'll only go if my husband wants to go. And he probably won't want to go because he was raised religious, but he was sort of had, rejected that. But it turned out he did want to go. And so the three of us went, and we were all dancing around in a circle. And I said to one of the people, wouldn't it be nice if services could be like this? And he said, well, they are at the House of Love and Prayer. And I said, what is that? And he said, well, it's in San Francisco and da-da-da. And so I ended up going there for Shabbat, like, you know, every chance I could, and got to know everyone. And then it turned out that someone was moving out and they asked me if I wanted to live there and be a roommate, you know, with one of the other women. And I remember coming home to my cute little apartment in Santa Rosa that I'd spent months fixing up, and realizing that as much as I loved it, I had to leave. And I just started crying and crying, because I didn't know whether I was crying because I was getting this wonderful opportunity, or because I had to, you know, completely upend my life. But anyway, I ended up living there for 2.5 years, and it was certainly a very rewarding experience.
Wow. Thank you, Sarah.
I'll jump in here.
Yes,
Also have, yeah, a story of a Jewish living experience that I'll touch on in a second. I wanted to first say that I'm actually the child of parents who met at a Kabbalah class, so very much wouldn't be here if that didn't come over during that time. And so coming from a younger generation, I'm 32 years old, that did have access to it and grew up in a family with it. Just like to share a little bit of my own story and some of what I'm discerning here as I listen to you and listen to your talk. I guess my discernment, my question really revolves around how much is finding one's Jewish home related to Jewish trauma versus could be related to non-Jewish related trauma, but yet affects one's Jewish involvement. So I'll just share very briefly that in a lot of my Jewish experience, I find myself very at home in Judaism when I'm very far away from more larger Jewish communities. The place where I felt most Jewish is actually in China, where I spent 5 years and was very involved in the Jewish community there, lived in a Moshe house there, a Jewish community home. So very involved. And yet when I'm generally back here in the States, like I am now, I feel less generally connected. And so I'm just curious, Shoshana, for your take on like how much of that finding home, finding our roots could be connected more with a Jewish trauma and individual, like not related to the Jewish part, and how to just break that apart.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're asking that. One of the things that I really felt in writing the book and where it opened up for me was that the Exodus story is really, it's from the Jewish text, it's from the Torah, but I think the teachings about healing from trauma are really universal. And that's the part that I'm glad you asked the question, because I was thinking I really wanted to say that. And that a lot of non-Jewish, Jung and Edward Edinger and a lot of the Jungians saw in the Exodus story this really story about the ego that's in a state of disconnection from something much larger. And so I think it's in this, the book is written about the experience of Jewish people reconnecting with Judaism, but I think that's like a particular example of a much larger experience of anybody who's in a state of exile from whatever we think of as the self, as God or as meaning or as a larger presence that I think the story has a lot to teach us about how we heal from that. So I don't think the trauma has to be Jewish, and I don't think the person has to be Jewish, and I don't think the healing has to be Jewish. It's a really profound story.
Right. Just ultimately, how are we in exile from ourself, capital S self, right? Just ultimately, like Judaism being one layer, one component, one part of that larger story, perhaps.
Yes, yes. This is how our culture made meaning of that. And I think, there is certainly a historical aspect to Jewish trauma and the way that the healing, ways to heal from trauma, was discussed in periods that followed great historical trauma, but it has a universal application.
Yeah. Hi, Shoshana.
Yes.
That's Rabbi.
Hi, Rabbi.
Hi. My question is about the Exodus itself. Michael Waltzer's wonderful book, Revolution or Exile. That is, we identify with Black people very strongly. At least I grew up in the civil rights movement. Right? And their paradigm is liberation through the Exodus and Moses, all the spirituals, all the feeling of oppression. We identified, we created alliances. And I'm just curious, in our own psyche, Ettinger speaks of this, and perhaps Neumann, are we to revolt against oppressors or to take ourselves out of the oppression, away? There's two models of Exodus and revolution, going into exile from the Pharaoh or overthrowing Pharaoh. And I get conflicted about that in my own self, whether I want to leave or revolt. And as a rabbi, do I want to leave, let people flee from trauma as my, or fight it? There's a lot going on, and personally, I find it sometimes confusing.
Yes.
And in terms of Black, of my relationship to Black power in the late 60s, do I identify with the violence of the Panthers and the Black Power movement to overthrow white supremacy, or do you want to work with it and leave it in a different way? So there's a lot I'm wrestling with here based on your book and some things I've read from other Jungian notions of the Exodus. So if you could speak to some of that.
Thank you. Well, such a question for our time too. The way that I work with it in the book is really look at the Pharaoh as something that we internalize, like an inner, I talk about the inner Pharaoh, and I really look at the work of a Jungian Donald Kalshed, who talks about this kind of inner persecutor. We can think of the inner critic. And so there's a way that the inner Pharaoh, when we've had trauma, or, as a person or as a collective, we can internalize that oppressor. And so, my understanding, where I came to with it, was what happens in the Red Sea when the Egyptian soldiers, fall into the water. And I look at the crossing of the Red Sea as a watery initiation, where we release our former identity of being a slave, being under Pharaoh, and we are birthed into a new identity, which we don't know what that is yet, but the Pharaoh is not in charge on the other side of the sea. And when I think about that collectively, in the time we're in, I don't know. I mean, it feels like many of us, I know, are trying to birth that new reality where the pharaohs don't reign, and where.
Yeah. Thank you. That's beautiful. Thank you.
Jenna, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, thanks. I think the question, or the response that's welling up in me is something about, I had heard recently from Martha Beck that she talks about the idea of coming to your senses in recovering from trauma. So as we're talking about this, right, like the exile from self to me is also the exile from the body. And what does it mean to inhabit our incarnate form so fully that it's actually an expression of the divine? And so there's something about, I just want your thoughts about that, because that was coming to mind as in particular, Jamie was talking. But I also think it's true about disidentifying from the Pharaoh, because I think the Pharaoh is entirely about not being embodied. And I think the feminine is all about being as wholeheartedly in our bodies and our senses as we can be. So just curious about your thoughts about that.
Thank you. Well, I think that's very much in the mystical tradition, is that the more we come in, the Shekhinah, or the feminine, is the embodied presence, or the presence that's immanent in all creation. And and I think the way that I talk about in the book, and what is the teachings of the Hasidic masters, who really taught after a tremendous and ongoing collective trauma, that to dance and to sing and to go out into nature. And I think in our time, the reclamation of the feminine aspect of the divine as a gateway into experiencing the divine in our bodies, as we meditate or dance or chant. So
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes. Yes to all of that. More dance parties, please.
yes. Abigail.
I just wanted to add to what's being said, that I have a practice which I learned when I was in graduate school with a Jungian professor, and it was very experiential. It was at Sonoma State, I hasten to add. And what I taught myself to do was to sit and wait for an impulse with my art materials, my books, everything around me, and wait for an impulse. And if the impulse was to get in my car and drive, I would get in my car and drive. And something would, or if it was to, sometimes I would write a poem, or I would do a sculpture, or I would move in a certain way. And it's the impulse. I feel that God is in the impulse that we find inside of ourselves. And most of the time, we're working from the orders of Pharaoh, which is up in the head. And that's how I see, that's how it seems to me. And most of the times we do what our head tells us to do. But when we allow time, and for me, there's a practice in Judaism called hitbodedut, which is basically, I learned it from Rabbi David Zeller, and you go out in the woods and you sit, he would say, do it for a therapeutic hour, and you talk with God. And I do that, but if you are listening, you get an answer. God talks. And that is, to me, that is the most exciting practice, and the most fruitful practice that I've known in my life. And I do that. And I, yes, you have to somehow find a way into the body. It's into the body, and it's in the body, it's in the breath. For me, it's in the breath. Different people find it in different ways.
Yeah, there is a way that Pharaoh is actually, I was surprised to see it, and I think it's from Isaac Luria in the 16th century, taught Pharaoh as the neck, which is where we cut off from the body, so it's a very deep teaching about how trauma disconnects us from the body, and how I don't know where I heard this. It was a really profound teaching that the 40 years in the desert was to get from here to here, to get from the head to the heart. That was what all the wandering was about. So I wanted to invite Shoshana and Abigail, if you wanted to share anything about being in the study, or just would love to invite your voices. No, it was quite a while ago now, but.
Oh, we haven't forgotten. Shoshana, would you like to go first? She's
She's connecting. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to join the computer audio because I was also listening through my headset. Anyway, for me, it was quite fascinating being in the group and being guided by Shoshana Fershtman to discuss our experiences of getting in touch with our Judaism. And I enjoyed that. And I was really, we've had many different contacts over the years. Shoshana Fershtman would write and say, okay, this is the transcript. Is this okay? And okay, here's the book. Is this, and so on and so forth. Or the PhD thesis, I guess, is one of the intermediary steps. And but what's completely fascinating to me about the book is the interpretation and how Shoshana has set our experiences in this setting of finding ourselves in Jewish renewal and finding ourselves in a psychological text. And I am just really, really thrilled by this having the privilege of being in this setting. So I really want to thank you.
Oh, thank you, Shoshana.
I would like to say something too. Being in this study, well, it was a lot of fun, and the profound experience for me was Shoshana's explanation of my family. I learned about my family, what I experienced growing up as a kind of a struggle to find Judaism in a secular family, that they were both kind of very angry about my interest in Judaism. And at the same time, they gave certain bits, like my father didn't like being Jewish, and they moved to Connecticut when I was 7. And the reason was they didn't want us to have an accent. And I didn't think they wanted us to be around Judaism, and there wasn't any in the town. I was the only Jewish kid in the school of Catholic kids. And so they did not want us. On the other hand, he would tell us Hasidic stories occasionally, and he would have Passover because he said it was a political holiday, and he would have that one. And at Passover, he would say, I was there. I was at Mount Sinai, which would give me prickles up my backbone. And my mother had some really bad experiences as a child. One was that she learned the 4 questions, and she was going to say them at Passover, and she said them, and her father said, well, now we have to have a boy say it, because it just didn't fulfill the ritual requirement to have a girl who was like a non-person ritually say it. And she was just really angry. And she had also been molested by a rabbi in her teens that was visiting, and she was waiting on the table, this fake, providing a meal. Her mother was providing a meal. And when they did this, she went and told her mother, and her mother told her to go to her room, and she waited on the rabbis. She didn't, that's not I see heads shaking. That's not a satisfactory response when someone molests your daughter. You throw them out of your house. You don't, But anyway, what was I going to say? What I got from the book was, I went through all these stages of finding renewal and finding renewal and finding renewal and finding the Judaism inside me and all of these things. But Shoshana explained to me that my family was ambivalent because of the trauma from the Holocaust, which I thought didn't affect us because we came here in 1917. So I thought it didn't affect us. But there was, first of all, that my mother remembered hiding behind a pickle barrel in the basement while the Cossacks were coming by in Russia. And what I realized from the book is that the family everybody is traumatized. All Jews are traumatized. We all have the trauma. And what I see, and we are all struggling out of this trauma, and Jews still reenact the trauma. We do it in our relationships in the congregation. We do it in our families and with our children. And we all have to find a way to heal the trauma and to be able to have a religion of love, a congregation of love, and there's one little story in the book that I'll tell, which is really fun, which is that I'm like 6 years old and we're having brunch and the morning after Passover, and believe it or not, there's no bread on the table, but I don't know anything about this. And I say, "Where's the bread?" And there's this dead silence. And then my mother says to the maid, "Bring Abigail some bread." And I say, 6 years old me, I say, "I don't want it if I'm not supposed to have it." And such was my journey toward Judaism. And when I found the Minyan, I still remember the moment of seeing a flyer on the wall at Sonoma State and thinking, oh, I could go there. Oh. And I did. And that was over 40 years ago. And it's I'll say another little story, which is that when I went for a long time, I wondered, how did they do it? How are they doing this? How are they doing it? I couldn't figure out how they were creating this feeling. And then one day in the high holidays, I was handed a poem to read and I read it to the audience and I thought, I'm channeling. And I turned around after I read the poem to go back to my seat, and Rovain Goldfarb was sitting there, one of the fathers of the Minyan, and I met his eyes, and I knew that he knew that I knew that I had done it. And that was just a story. That's a story of being in Jewish Renewal.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you.
And I got so much from being in the study because I got to understand my family's ambivalence as ambivalence.
Yeah, thank you. The one thing that I found for myself, and I think, I got this working with everyone in the study, is that there's some idea, I think, that many of us have that some people are, comfortably Jewish, and, that's just how it is for them. And if we're uncomfortable, there's something odd about us. And what I've really come to see is that, and this was somebody, psychologist Jerry Diller, who studied Jewish identity in the 80s, said that most Jews are very conflicted in their identity. And it was just very freeing, I think, for, to reframe it that way, that there's not those people over there who belong in temple and are completely comfortable. Everybody is struggling with something, something that's been unworked through in the family in some way.
Knowing that is very freeing. Yeah. Understanding that is very freeing, and it's freeing in our relationships and in ourselves.
Yes.
I don't want to take too much time, but our book club did come up with a question for you.
Oh, great.
Dr. Fershtman. We wanted to know, since you're both an attorney and a doctor, what has influenced you in how you experience yourself as a Jew?
What has influenced me? Well, I write a lot about that in the book. I really wasn't practicing Judaism at all when this all started for me. And but I think what's influenced me, is that the question, really, when I started engaging with Judaism, it was a lot of coming to Berkeley from Sonoma County, and coming to the Minyan, and coming to Chokhmat Halev, and studying with various teachers, and going to Jewish Renewal, Kalan, and Ruach Haaretz, and I think finding a way in that just felt meaningful, that I could have a practice that brought me into my feeling. So I think things like Shefa's chanting and so many things. I mean, coming to services, I was thinking of services I've been to at the Minyan that were just incredibly ecstatic and touching something that brought me so much joy that I,
Thank you.
yeah. I think, Aviva, did you have a question earlier or something you wanted to share?
I've been trying to figure out how to frame it. I'm going to try. Okay. So, I was positively involved in Judaism. My father was a cantor. However, my mother tragically died when I was 9 years old. And of course, thank goodness my father was a very loving man, and he was a very wonderful cantor and singer in a Reconstructionist congregation, it turns out, outside of New York in Yonkers. So, I grew up with this, but my internal pharaoh was sexism. Okay? They sent my brother to an Orthodox Jewish day school, and they sent me to public school because he was a boy and I was a girl. Even though I was very interested, and very good at languages and very good at singing and all of that, he was the one who got that education. He turned out to be in mergers and acquisitions, and I turned out to be a cantor. Okay, fine. So fast forward, and I got a good background. I finally, in my last 2 years of high school, got to go to a Jewish day school in Philadelphia. My father had taken a job at Mainline Reform Temple, where my brother and I refused to go because there was not enough Hebrew in the service. Finally, I began. Akiba Hebrew Academy which is now Barak Academy, nothing to do with Obama. So I was able to actually learn high level stuff with the other kids and feel like I was, a fully accepted Jew. But so fast forward, I went to Brandeis, I majored in sociology, and wasn't sure what I was going to do when I got out of school. I'd been singing for Jewish organizations here and there. I learned to play the guitar, etc. And I talked to my father, and he said, well, Aviva, you could be a teacher, you could be a nurse, or you could be a social worker. But don't be a social worker because it's too hard. Obviously, he did not say, you could be a cantor. So, I went to school, back to school, and got a degree in music education, started teaching in the outskirts of Boston. But then, I was working in synagogues, teaching music to the kids and doing the occasional solo in the service. So one day, it was in Boston, I had met my husband by that time, and I got a call from a rabbi I'd worked with in Boston, Haskell Burnett. And he said, Aviva, I've become the rabbi at Temple Israel of Hollywood. And nobody sings. He was brought up Hasidic, this Reform rabbi was brought up. Nobody sings. We need somebody to get them to sing. They just listen to the choir emanating from the choir loft. I want you to come and be the cantor. And I said, but I'm not a cantor, because I hadn't,
at the training, and he said, I know you can do what this congregation needs. So sometimes Moses calls you, shows you the burning bush.
Yes.
And gets you out of your preconceived notions of what you're supposed to do or be. So I became the cantorial soloist at Temple Israel, studied with a family friend, and eventually became the first full-time woman cantor in Los Angeles.
Wow.
I was at Temple Israel of Hollywood for 32 years. So I had my own Exodus experience and my own revelatory experience. So thank you. That's Dibarti.
Beautiful, Shemati. Yeah. Well, I think that's really, thank you for bringing in sexism. And I think that's a really major theme in the book for me. I just was a feminist from such an early part of my life. And, early on felt like I really couldn't be Jewish and a feminist because the tradition was so, just so patriarchal. And it's so a lot of what has been my own journey, and I speak to in the book, is I remember running in, I was living up in Boonville and running into Leah Novick was there for a conference at a retreat center there. I wasn't involved with Judaism at all. And I just happened to have a conversation with her at a cafe, and I didn't know who she was. And she started talking about the Shekhinah and that they were having this Ruach Haaretz, the spirit of the land, and the Shekhinah. And I was like, oh, okay, maybe there is a way in, maybe there's a whole new version of Judaism. So, so important. That's such an important. So.
That's where I met you, Shoshana.
Oh.
Yeah, I ran Ruach Haaretz with Leah that year.
Oh.
I'm Leah and I and Aaron, Ron Feldman, we founded Ruach Haaretz in one of our first Mount Madonna, and then we went to Philo, California.
Oh, wonderful.
And ran a retreat on the Shekhinah, and Leah and I put together the program. Yeah.
Oh, how
That's
wonderful.
where I met you.
Yes.
And you have it in your book. The story is in your book that you were outside the store, and
yes,
and then Leah Novick walked up to you.
Yeah.
Be more perfect.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Well, I must have met you at the same time also, because I was one of the 5 founders of Ruach Haaretz.
Oh, how wonderful.
But what I really wanted to do is reinforce what was said about the patriarchal nature of Judaism. When Aviva told the story, I was sent to Hebrew school for 5 years, not a day school, but after school, Hebrew school, 5 days a week for a couple of hours, because I was the boy, And Bev, this is my sister, where were you sent? Shula, to a Yud Lamed Peretz Shula, which was around the corner. And it exemplified, but it mirrored what the Jewish woman's experience had been throughout medieval and up to modern times, where there was a special book written in Yiddish called the Tzena Urena. And while the men were davening in Hebrew and, reading the Torah and everything else, the women were up with the balcony or behind a wall, a mechitza, and they were given this Yiddish book to read because, of course, they weren't expected to read or understand Hebrew, and they weren't expected to daven, and they weren't expected to understand what the Torah Parsha was about. So they had this concise book in Yiddish, sort of summarizing what the Torah was, so the women could participate and understand, but on a lower level. Very patronizing.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I want to just, it feels like we're winding down. It's just been such a joy to be together. And thought maybe I could close with reading a poem that I opened the book with from Roger Kamenetz. How does that feel to everyone? This is a poem I found right around the time I had a meditation that just really opened me up to Judaism. So this is called The Broken Tablets. The broken tablets were also carried in an ark, insofar as they represented everything shattered, everything lost. They were the law of broken things, the leaf torn from the storm, from the stem in a storm, the leaf torn from the stem in a storm, a cheek touched in fondness once, but now the name forgotten. How they must have tumbled, clattered on the way, even carried so carefully through the wasteland. How they must have rattled around until the pieces broken into pieces, the edges softened, crumbling, dust collected at the bottom of the ark, ghosts of old letters, old laws. Insofar as a law broken is still remembered, these laws were obeyed. And insofar as memory preserves the pattern of broken things, these bits of stone were preserved through many journeys and ruined days, even they say, into the promised land.
Well, thank you very much,
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Shoshana. And we're going to leave the mics on if people want to talk a little more. And I'd like to let you know that we do have this book group on Shoshana's books. And if a few more people would like to join, I think that would be great. And you can find it in the Minyan schedule or call somebody or whatever to find it. And if you want to talk a little more now, we always hang out and leave the mics open and
sure,
let people chat. And it's been a wonderful evening. We want to thank you so much for coming. It's been absolutely inspiring, and I'm sure we're going to want to have you come again and do something more. And in fact, Rabbi has told me so I know it. And
it's fun to have you back.
Yes, and thank you all for joining and for all the wonderful open sharing that went on, which was great. And I just want to let you know that you're welcome at the Aquarian Minyan. We have services Friday night and Saturday morning. We have Aquarian Minyan yeshiva classes at noon most days and sometimes at other times. And on the weekend, we have some very good classes on davening and spirituality and prayers, and that are led by the rabbi and by Ami Goodman. And we, kind of come on down. And we're new people always welcome. And so thank you very much, Shoshana.
Thank you.
And I'll just open the mic for whoever.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's great to be with you all.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Is Dan here? I want him to make it. Dan, are you still here?
Host now. Dan had to go.
Oh, you're the host? Okay. You're the host. So things are, well, Purim is coming. Also, don't forget Purim. Come to the Minyan for Purim. I hear a rumor that there's going to be a Purim play that's about St. Patrick's Day because it's on St. Patrick's Day. So we're going to have Purim with a brogue.
Yeah, Purim on Zoom. So you can come
on Zoom, right? Everything is, at this point, everything is on Zoom.
Good night and thank you very much. It was wonderful.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
You guys stayed up late.
Yes,
Shoshana, Shoshana, will you be here for a minute? Excuse me. It's Susan.
Yes,
Shoshana,
yes.
okay, all right, I'll wait. I wanted to share something with you about Jewish mysticism and Gershom Scholem.
Very nice.
Should I do it? Or
Go
is
ahead.
someone else talking? Okay, anyway, my favorite friend in Israel, whom I met in 1970, and she died unexpectedly and suddenly a few years ago. Her name was Yael Aviona. She grew up across the street from Gershom Scholem, and she used to play in his house because her father was Mikal Aviona, the famous archaeologist of the Second Temple. Okay, anyway, Yael said that I had read major trends in Jewish mysticism. I was very interested in Jewish mysticism in college. And anyway, she said he was so academic, not in the least bit mystical. And then when I saw her another time in Israel, I guess it was the last time, she had become religious and very mystical. If I showed you a picture of the four angels, I mean, you can listen to an interview with her, you'll see what I mean. She said Gershom Scholem became a mystic at the end of his life. He told me some stories, but that's beside the point. But anyway, she is so mystical. I mean, she was. And you want to see her. Her name was Yael Avi Yona, A-V-I Yona, Y-O-N-A-H, Yona. And it's called, she has a website still up that her husband had left up. It's called Kabbalah Art and Science. And if you want to see an interview with her, you'll kind of get a sense of what I mean. You can see, you go to YouTube and just type Yael Aviona, and there's an interview with her that was made from South Africa not that long ago. But it was, she was a feminist, and yet she was so religious. And I thought her husband was oppressive. I really did. I mean, and I did visit them in Sfat when I was in Israel in 2019. I don't know if you read what I posted about going there for the 30th anniversary of Women of the Wall and the experience of what happened to me twice with those women who were insulted, said I couldn't say Kaddish at the wall. I wrote all that. But I guess it's worth listening to her, I think. And her paintings became so mystical, and she ended up having an aneurysm to her brain when she was 70. So God works in very mysterious ways. But anyway, I want to thank you. This talk has meant so much to me because of my interest in Carl Jung and his work. And I did ask you, was Carl Jung anti-Semitic at any point?
Well, I talk about that quite a bit in the book.
I want to read the book.
Yeah, it's very complex. He really, his relationship with Gershom Scholem, I think, was really, basically, I mean, I can succinctly say, I think he was unconsciously anti-Semitic in the way that most of us are unconsciously racist. He grew up in a very anti-Semitic culture, but he had a lot of Jewish students. I think he was ignorant of the depth of Jewish mysticism, and like many Christians of his time, saw Judaism as kind of the way that Christians can look at the Old Testament,
right,
as less developed. But in his later life, he became very taken with Kabbalah and studied with Gershom Scholem, and Erich Neumann, I think, had a big influence on Jung in understanding Jewish mysticism. And he became quite mystical, quite Kabbalistic. It became a big part of his life. And there's a wonderful book called C.G. Jung and Jewish Mysticism that really goes.
I'd love to read that. I really would.
Yeah. So it's quite complex. I think he really grew over the course of his life and really understanding the depth of Judaism, but it didn't start out that way. But in terms of being anti-Semitic, I I don't think that pans out. That's something that's been leveled at him, but he tried to get a lot of people out of Germany. He made some stupid comments, in the early 30s that he regretted, and it's very complex. And I go into it in great depth in the book.
Great.
Yeah.
I'll definitely get the book. And, the elder friend I wrote about that I met when I was, because of her brother lived in San Francisco with his wife. She never married. She went to Zurich every summer. I wrote a little about her to you. She was Jewish, and Marie von Franz was her analyst. But I just was saying that she was Jewish, and she ended up she sold insurance at one point, and she ended up going to the Institute because she had a dream. I remember the beaver dream, and someone she knew who was a Jungian, she didn't even know what meant, said to her, "You have to go to Zurich and you can tell Marie von Franz your dream," and her whole life was changed.
Wow. Oh.
And she went every summer until she was in her 80s. Just amazing. I loved her so much. Just a very interesting person. Yeah. So blessed to have had so many elder women friends there, except for Abigail. They're all deceased.
Well, just wait a while.
Oh God, no! I hope you'll outlive me. Don't.
God forbid.
Anyway, so you're so amazing. I just wanted to show. You're just awesome, and when I read about you, I signed up for this right away.
Oh, thank you, Susan. I'm so glad that you were here.
Oh, what a privilege to be with you. I hadn't heard about you before this, and I want so the two books that you suggest are that I'm really interested in the trauma book, and that's I'll get the titles from Abigail. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I reference the C.G. Jung and Jewish mysticism in my book, so you'll.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, do you have a website?
Yes, I can put that in the chat, or it's just my name. So, and that has my email too, so you can reach me there.
Which is the book you recommend about trauma?
That's Donald Kalshed has two books, but his more recent book is called Trauma and the Soul.
Well, very similar to Susan, I also signed up as soon as I saw this advertised through the Aleph newsletter. And really, I'm on the East Coast, so I stayed up late for this, and it was really great to be here.
Oh, it's so nice to have you with us.
And on Jung and anti-Semitism, I just read Memories, Dreams, Reflections this past summer. And, he has this incredible story of the Jewish woman who came to see him in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, who her grandfather was a tzaddik, and she was completely secular and had no connection to any kind of spirituality, and it turned out that she was an extremely spiritual person who needed to get in touch with that, and completely transformed her life, at least the way he tells the story in the book. So yeah, and I also really appreciate, I read the previous summer Jung and the Story of Our Time by Lawrence Vanderpost, and he talks a bit about the Jung and anti-Semitism. I know there's a lot of places, and very much got that sense that, certainly consciously he did improved over time, and unconsciously he was a man of his time and his culture in terms of anti-Semitism.
Yes. And what you're saying about how he worked with that young woman, the Jews that were students and disciples of Jung, or he really encouraged them to connect with their Judaism. So people like Rivka Scharf Kluger, who went on to write books, he actually what they say about Jung is that he really encouraged them to connect with their Judaism and the deeper meaning of it. And I think that's a piece that often gets overlooked.
And about Jung and Freud. I mean, that's a whole other piece. I mean, Freud being a Jew, do you think there was anything about his Jewishness besides all the stuff we already know about in their conflict?
Yes, there's a lot in the book. You'll enjoy it. I go deep into Freud's Judaism, and I think it's kind of amazing how the roots of psychology are all bound up with Judaism, and very interesting, very, very interesting.
That's, yes, it must be to know more about it, but yeah, for sure. No, you've been in Vienna, I assume. Yes.
I really,
Shoshana, Vienna? Have you been in Vienna?
No, I haven't.
Oh, you must go. You must
Yeah, I'd
go.
love
I mean,
to.
when we were there, we went to the coffee house where Freud was. We went to Freud's house
Oh,
and his what do you call it? His office, whatever, with the couch and all that. But anyway, what was the most interesting there for me was watching footage of home, like some home movies, etc., and watching Anna Freud, isn't she the daughter? Anna was the daughter.
Yeah.
How he related to her as a child when she kind of run to him to pick me up and she'd extend his arms and he didn't pick her up. I mean, there were things I saw in that were just, because I don't understand German, they were just, more movement, but it was interesting. And he wore a suit and with a tie and all these outdoor scenes in their backyard, or it was just, I don't know that much about their relationship really, but it was just something that stood out for me. But Vienna is so underrated as a city. I hadn't been there. I've been there twice now because of my husband's meetings, and musically it is a feast. It is just astonishing how much music there is. So it's really worth visiting as a city, and for sure, and Salzburg is nearby.
Yes.
I would like to encourage anybody that cares to join our monthly book club, and I put the link in the chat to go ahead and buy the book and start reading it. I think we're going to be dealing with chapters 4 and 5 on the 17th of this month, and
it meets once a month, so you have plenty of time to study in between the meetings.
Well, that sounds good.
And it's a very enjoyable thing because it's a serious endeavor. People like it a lot.
it sparks very interesting conversation.
Oh, how wonderful. I'm so moved that you're taking it up for study. That's wonderful.
I have an interesting story, a short one I'd like to tell about Jung and Judaism. It's not really about Jung himself. As I said, I went to Sonoma State for my master's, and I started with the late Gordon Tappan, who was a Jungian professor, and he was a wonderful professor. By his courses were very experiential, and they were fabulous. And he was a good friend of the Jungian scholar James Hillman. And Hillman would come to visit a lot. And one night, Gordon and his wife invited me to dinner, and Hillman was there. And we were sitting at the table and talking, and they were talking about dream groups they'd had. And James Hillman said, I had a dream group in Zurich for only Jewish men. And I had no idea. And I looked at Gordon, who wasn't Jewish at all. And Gordon looked at me, and he did something very Jewish. He went, yep, he is. I had no idea that James Hillman was Jewish. And
well, that's surprising.
Yeah, I didn't know that for a long time.
Right.
Familiar with his work, and then he doesn't talk about it very much. It's really interesting.
So it was funny because Gordon used to tell me I was too Jewish, and later on, I think he got the idea. He used to at first try to wean me away from it, but didn't really happen.
What did he mean? What did he mean by too Jewish?
Well, I think he thought that my deep spirituality, Judaism, it seems very rigid on the outside.
Oh yeah, that kind, right? The Orthodox, right?
Yeah, well, so does the Reform in its own way. And
definitely.
Once I was in a room with Gordon.
It depends on which Reform rabbi these days. Totally.
It depends. I was once in a room with Reb Zalman and about 90 people, and he said he wanted everybody to say how they came to Jewish renewal. And I watched this unfold for an afternoon. About half the people said they came from Reform because there was nothing there and it was no God there and nothing. And half the people said they came from Orthodoxy because it was too rigid and they couldn't stand it. It was so interesting because, you know, and then of course there were the people like me who sort of came from nothing. You know, it wasn't really, I learned from Shoshana that it wasn't really nothing, that it was ambivalence.
When I taught 7th and 8th grade with a team of 3 others, and I had met Reb Zalman on the Berkeley campus, he came with my 7th and 8th graders for a Shabbaton in the woods. And these kids were so taken with him. I mean, it was unbelievable. You can imagine, you know, when he was singing, you know, the prayers to, you know, melodies that the kids loved. Some popular songs, and when the movement, you know, everything, and the mysticism and all of that. And I guess it just really made such a difference, because Sunday school, we transformed Sunday school by starting this conference program that I was one of the founders of. They came once a month for a Shabbaton, Friday night and all day Saturday, and everybody loved it. And it's interesting, out of that group, there are 3 rabbis now, and 1 boy made Aliyah. So you can work within the Reform movement to do things. They're very involved in climate and so many good things and social action. So I really, dislike it when people totally down it. And some Reform rabbis are very spiritual, and most of them might not be, but I mean, there are many that are. And so I'm just saying that what I found that I haven't liked about Reformed synagogues is that the people are not friendly. That they tend to be very, if you come in from off the street, you'll stand there and no one will talk to you. It's so different.
Especially if you're a single woman.
Oh yes, I know. So I mean that there is a big difference in that way. But as far as the movement and all the good they do, I just dislike it when people down it.
Well, I think we're getting sleepy now, and
Yes.
Anybody have some last words? Because I think we should.
Yeah, I just have a final question, and just first a comment to your Susan agree about not downing Reform. My family and I have been doing an amazing Jewish meditation with Rabbi Angela Buchdahl from Central Synagogue the whole pandemic, and it's been a fantastic resource for us.
Yeah, go ahead, Jamie. I want to just.
Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think what is really important is that renewal was really intended to be not a separate denomination, but to infuse all the denominations to renew with renewed energy and renewed connection to the depths. So yeah, I think it's really important not to kind of put renewal up here and the other denominations, that the idea is that everything is being renewed. And
I think that's really true. And that's definitely the position of the organization. That's the Aleph.
I think there's renewal throughout the whole of Jewish life.
Yes.
And, little Orthodox girls having some kind of a bat mitzvah, even if they don't get to hold the Torah, and baby namings for girls among the Orthodox, and all kinds of stuff is waking up. And then this denomination on its own, spawned, so to speak, by Reb Zalman and Rabbi Marsha Prager, until recently headed the rabbinical school, its own rabbinical school, and ordains its own rabbis. And that's the kind of the neo-Hasid feminist thing that we are very much involved in. But yes, it's
very true.
Spreading out through all the denominations.
It is. I mean, it's really made it. Yes.
Rabbi Angela.
Can I?
Lead meditation. It's really wonderful.
Anywhere you go, they sing our music.
Oh.
Anywhere you walk in, they're singing our music.
A lot of chef.
Just the fact that the rabbi of a major New York synagogue is named Angela Buchdahl, it's kind of says a lot.
And do you know she's Asian American? She's Korean.
Oh, I know.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask the
Angela went to
question
Hebrew
before.
Union College. I just want to tell you that Angela was ordained Reform and went to Hebrew Union College and Central Synagogue as a Reform synagogue. And she's wonderful, but I'm just saying, and they use a lot of Shlomo's music, etc. And the Shamas perform there many times, and I sometimes go to them on Zoom. But I just want to say that she's one of many who came out of Reform Judaism. So I'm just making a point. But basically, though, I really adore a lot of the women rabbis in Renewal. They're really, well, you know, there's so many amazing.
The female leadership is very important, and it's been very important at the Minyan.
Another person, if you haven't heard her, Abigail, you really should go to Ikar. Do you know Ikar? IKAR. Hear Rabbi Sharon Browse. She actually
she's incredible. Yeah.
Isn't
she's a
she?
force.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
That's actually.
She led the Seders during the Obama years in the White House. But aside from that, her passion, and well, I just love to listen to her sermons. I'm glad you feel the same. Isn't she wonderful?
Yeah. One of the 3 best Jewish experiences I ever had was when I went to Ikar in person.
What's
when I was in LA.
What's the rabbi's name?
Sharon Browse. I'll put it in the chat.
It's Los Angeles community.
And another one that also has her own following in her own synagogue and is one of my favorites, and I've read all her books, is Rabbi Naomi Levy. And she's Neshua. They're a synagogue without a building, but she'll get 400 and 500 people. And she says she gets more in donations than if she charged dues of $1,000. She is really special too. Naomi Levy. I don't know if you know her. She is in LA. Neshua, I think. Neshuva, I think, is her synagogue without walls. I mean, she herself is very spiritual, and her father was murdered when she was a child in Brooklyn. And he had a grocery store. But anyway, she's really someone to listen to. And her book, To Begin Again, I read it a couple of times. It was really
totally caught up in that. Just like, yeah.
Well,
do you know of her? You're so amazing, by the way. I wish I could come to Urban Adamah. I recognize you. I live in San Mateo. Aren't you Urban Adamah?
Me?
Yes?
No.
Oh, no. Who?
No,
the guy who was just talking.
Oh,
but
Jamie.
Is he at Urban Adamah?
I think, Jamie, are you on the East? I think he's on the East Coast.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, I have to go because it's late here, so I'm going to say goodnight.
I'd like to.
Thank you.
I'd like to.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to say goodnight too. It's been just wonderful to see you.
Shoshana, it's been wonderful having you. I'm sure we're going to have you again. So
I hope so. And Abigail and Shoshana, thank you so much for all you're still doing, for finding Lorelei, and for being a major force in Renewal. And thank you for bringing her here and for everything.
So we're going to let Shoshana go. And I would just like to inquire if there's anybody else still holding on who would like to say something.
I'm getting going.
Susan, we're going to see if some of the people who haven't talked.
I'm going to go, and
Bye.
good night. Good night. Lila
Bye.
Tov, have a pleasant night.
Goodbye. Who else is here? Mac, are you still here, or is it just your living room? I think it's just you. And Ellen Solot, are you still here? I guess nobody's still here, but you and me.
Is Sky here? Is Sky here?
He's gone.
He's gone.
So good night, everybody. Shoshana, why don't you close it down?
I will.